All right, what's up, guys? We are live for episode number 55 of the Before the Trainwreck series. I'm joined tonight by my good friend Rollo Tomassi. How you doing, brother?
Hey, good. How are you?
Good. So we have a topic tonight on men and women not being the same. And this is something I know you've written about. I think you've at least done one or two conversations on your own channel about this. We've certainly hit on this as a group before. But we always hear some guy throw out some objection to things we talk about with some narrative along the lines of, well, if women aren't allowed to be promiscuous, how is it that men can get away with that? I don't understand. What about equalism and all that sort of stuff? And I think I want to start from a place of optics, because if you've been walking this earth long enough and you've been intimate with a fine lady and stood in front of the mirror with her after said intimacy, you will notice that men and women are in fact quite different.
Yes.
There's certain things that men can do, and there's certain things that women can do. There's certain things that we can both do, in fact. But the optics are pretty obvious to me anyway. I got a couple of talking points here. So why many beliefs don't always apply to both men and women? Let's start with that one. And I kind of want to start with a promiscuity thing.
Okay.
Where should we go with this one?
Oh, okay. Well, first off, when you have to understand why people think everything needs to be equal. This is something that I actually have a dedicated chapter to. Well, part of it, anyways. In book 4 that I'm working on right now, and it's called Heirs of the Blank Slate. And if you have never read, there's a great book by Dr. Steven Pinker called The Blank Slate, and it's called The Modern Denial of Human Nature. And what I get into, at least in the first part of the book, is that there's a lot of like sort of this what I call old order thinking that we have dragged with us into sort of our new information age. And I think one of the most damaging, certainly the most, I guess, endemic idea is that for every action, there has to be an equal and opposite reaction. And while that works really well in physics or, in basic, scientific kind of stuff, it doesn't necessarily apply to human beings. And to say that human beings aren't equal or shouldn't be equal is almost like heresy today, because if you think about it, it's something
that outrage.
Yeah, it will create a lot of outrage, because people will apply it to like racial things or apply it to religious things, or they'll apply the equality, what I call equalism, to everything that they can. Now, in our line of our sphere, I guess, we talk about intersexual dynamics, and to suggest that men and women are not the same is almost the same as saying that they are inherently unequal, or they're not equal. And I don't think enough people actually apply critical thinking to why we presume that. So if like you go and you look at like the Constitution, or these old Enlightenment era ideals that human beings are all innately, God created all men equal kind of thing, right? It's in the U.S. Constitution, right? I believe it is, or it's in the somewhere along the line. The founder said, we believe that all men are born equal, blah blah blah. Of course, whether that applies in practice or not is really kind of up to the people who believe in it. But the idea is that it goes back to the blank slate, and that's an old idea called tabula rasa, which is blank slate, which means that pretty much the way we are today, or what we are as like our personalities as a society, how we relate to the opposite sex, how we relate to each other, is all based on what's called social constructionism. And that means, and I'm sure you've heard this before, like, well, gender is a social construct, so we can be anything we want to be, kind of thing.
Yeah, that's a new wave thing we've seen in the last few years.
When I was writing book 4, I kind of dug into like, why do we think that? Why do we think that we all should be just these sort of blank slate equals? And
I don't think that. Why do some people think that?
Some people. Well, how do we get from standing in front of the mirror naked, right, and say, oh, there's obviously some differences here, to what, 68 different genders, right? Like whatever the latest number, maybe it's 71 now, I'm not sure. But how do we get from there to there? And really it comes down to social constructionism. And I'm sure you've probably heard of the idea of nature versus nurture. And so I think a lot of people are really scared of the idea that one thing that really scares people is when we talk about evolution, or we talk about evolutionary psychology, that sort of has a lot of negative connotations for people who have this ideal that we should all be equal. And it's not just like progressive liberals, it's also conservatives. It's also traditional tradcons, to say that it's all nurture, like it's this binary thinking, right? If it can't be one, then it has to be the other. So if I say, well, if it's not social constructionism, then it's like sort of this biological determinism. And
do you ever get criticized for binary thinking?
For me?
Yeah.
If I do, it's only
say, Rollo, you're too black and white.
I'm actually, if anything, I'm too gray. I think I've been accused of being a moral relativist. That's for sure.
I'm the guy that gets the black and white criticisms.
Really? I occasionally do, but usually it's only when I say something that the other person has a binary response to. So they presume that if like for instance, I'm about to say here that there are differences between men and women that are biologically provable. I can show you, brain scans. I can show you the studies showing that, for instance, one of the examples I use a lot is that men and women process emotions differently. I can prove that to you, with fMRI scans. I can show you how men and women's brains, the synapses are wired differently. We can see natural proclivities in men, and we can see natural proclivities in women. Like one of the things that's really interesting is like if I say women have a natural proclivity for communication, I don't think that's not a radical statement, right? Women text more, they talk more, they're more like when I talk about how men and women, the differences in men and women's communication styles, like men communicate overtly, women communicate covertly. Women think that that's flattering, right? Well, we're smarter than you guys. We're better than you guys because we have a better capacity for communication styles, right? Then women get more out of seeing, let's say, sub-communications. I've done lots of different, essays and videos about sub-communications and how like pickup artists have learned that that's what women like. They'll look at your shoes, or they'll look at an expression or a vocal intonations and things like that, and they pick up more information than men do. And men seem like they're dumb. They're not dumb. They just communicate in a different way. And that is a biological fact. It's an evolved proclivity that women have. And when you say something like that, and it is flattering to the feminine, women are all about it. You will never hear women say, well, that's a double standard. Men should be just as communicative as women. They don't care about that because it's flattering to womankind's ego. But if I go and I say men are better at math than women are, if I say that men have better spatial, like physical spatial, whatever, interpreting
recollection.
Yeah. If I say that, then I'm an asshole. Then I am suddenly a misogynist. Or if I say, well, men, this is easily provable, is like I could say, well, boys have an innate ability to throw objects more accurately than women do, or girls do. And that's where we get the, you throw like a girl kind of thing. Right? Whereas boys naturally put their shoulders into it because they had to be the hunters back in our hunter-gatherer days. If I say that, then women will say, well, that's not true. You can teach a girl to be a pitcher, right? And I said, yeah, you can teach her, but she doesn't have the natural proclivity for that. And so when it's in favor of men, it's misogyny. If it's in favor of women, if it's flattering to the female, then suddenly it's like, yeah, go girl. And that's really sort of a sign of how we want to be blank slate equalists until it serves whatever our ideological bent happens to be. And so when I was doing the research for book 4, when I was looking at the blank slate, and of course I've read Dr. Pinker's work as well, it's interesting to me that even today, with all of this new information, this new data, we can easily go on Google and find, and that's how I found out about all of this stuff. It's not hard to look. You just have to have the sort of the intellectual curiosity to look for the stats and look for things that sort of back up what you suspect is true. And so I thought about this, and I'm sure you've run into this too, because we were looking at this kind of today. I think on Zuby on Twitter had something like, I don't understand why it's a radical statement to say that men and women are different. Well, it is, because it offends this old order thinking that we are all blank slates and we all have equal potential, or if we don't, we should. And when we don't, it's society's fault, or it's men's fault, or it's endemic sexism's fault. And so you get a guy like James Damore who gets fired from Google for simply saying, look, men and women are different, and here are the gender differences.
I bet you if a woman wrote that paper, there wouldn't be an issue.
Yeah, there wouldn't be anything going on. And I'll tell you what I've discussed this with you before, like Dr. Steven Pinker, or like guys like Warren Farrell, or even Jordan Peterson. They really frustrate me because they have all of this data that's just sort of sitting in their laps with respect to gender differences and things like that. And even the guys who are doing the research and doing the studies and coming up with all the data on this, even those guys have to sort of back up off of it and say, well, you know, it looks like men and women are different, but I'm still a feminist. So
you know what's funny about that? It's funny that you mentioned Warren Farrell, because we were talking before we went live about that chapter in my book where I'm introducing the female primary social order from my perspective to kind of segue into the rest of the book. Mm-hmm. And I use Warren Farrell's material from The Myth of Male Power to kind of illustrate that point that you're making right there. Mm-hmm. So you're right. I mean, like a lot of these guys that have built their careers on writing papers and books and speaking and being on boards in these areas, they don't want to acknowledge it. But it's like let me give you a really good example. The other day, I had to get some brand new tires for the R8, right? So scheduling the appointment, as I'm leaving the house, I said, I'm going to the place behind the Audi dealership that does the work on the R8. The R8's out of warranty. It doesn't need to go to the dealership. My girlfriend's followed me there probably 4 times. So I leave. I said, meet me over there. She didn't make it there, because I lost her, at a couple stoplights. She didn't make it there. So she went to the Audi dealership instead. So after a while sitting there waiting, I'm like, okay, she obviously didn't know where to go, and I had to go back and get her. And I'm like, what are you doing over here? And she's going, well, isn't this where we're supposed to be? No, this is not the place. I said the place that works on the R8 behind the Audi dealership. So spatial awareness, like women are very, very good with certain things, and men are very, very good with certain things. But men had to be good with spatial awareness because we had to rely on it to feed people and defend.
To defend, also to find your way back to
find your way back to the tribe, the camp, and all that sort of stuff. It's just an innate bit of hardwiring that we have, and it's not to say that one's better than the other. It's like how you just describe it, where it's like we are complementary to one another.
Right.
We don't compete with one another.
The strengths that the masculine has, the innate strengths that the masculine have, complements the weakness of the feminine, and vice versa. I mean, I'm not saying
that's okay.
Like people always say, well, Rollo, like I was looking today, and where did I put it? Somebody had done a poll about like, oh, is it bad? Is it a negative thing that men are stoic and are reserved with their emotions? And of course, because we live in a feminine primary society where we emphasize emotional expression, and it's always like Dr. Everett Piper calls it feels before reals. It's everywhere. It's in the church. It's in politics. It's in our, just our discussion, that we should always feel before we actually think. And I've talked about how men and women differ when it comes to instinct, emotion, and reason. Well, if you look at how women prioritize, and that's how they process information is instinct, emotion, and reason, whereas men's innate way of doing it is instinct, reason, and then emotion. See how we feel about it. I did a little bit of research on that as well. I say, well, okay, is this something that I can, at least find something that correlates with what I suspect? And sure enough, I did. Men tend to process things in a rational or a reasonable way, and then they decide how they feel about it. And there's an easy way to, and this sort of gets back to our topic here, is an easy way to prove this, is that when women are looking, when we talk about hypergamy, women are looking for that quality, and they make emotional investments in guys that they want to have some sort of parental investment in. That's why they're always looking for the one, or they're looking for some sort of emotional connection with the guy. And then, for instance, like what you were just saying a minute ago, is a lot of women will say, well, they'll presume that a double standard means this, that if a guy has sex with a lot of women, then he's a hero. And if a woman has sex with a lot of men, then she is a slut. And then, of course, they say, well, that's a horrible double standard. How could it be this way? Why are you slut shaming, blah, blah, blah? Well, why does that exist is because men and women are different. Men and women have different and competing adversarial mating strategies. And in the terms of men, and this gets back to the processing here, is men can have sex with a lot of women and divest themselves from the sexual act, from that part of it, the emotional side of it. No, it's not to say that men don't invest themselves emotionally. They do. But if you look at like pornography, why is pornography such a big deal for guys? Well, there's a part of our innate proclivities that allows us to have sex, to hit it and quit it, right? Like John would say, ejaculate and evacuate. Mm-hmm. That's a natural, biological, evolved proclivity in men, because that is what our innate sexual mating strategy was about. Spread the seed, have sex with as many, it's like what do they call it? R-selected mating strategy. Whereas for women, it's K-selected. They want to, invest in one, because for women, they have to. They're the incubators of the next generation, and it takes 9 months to gestate a child, and it takes at least another 7 or 8 years until that child can at least can feed itself, right, and run away from danger in our ancestral past. And so what that facilitated was different mating strategies. Guess what? We're different. We have different goals. We have different ways of coming together. Now, sometimes they're mutually, beneficial, and sometimes they're not. And particularly now, they're not. But when women get frustrated with that, they're saying, "Oh, well, this is a double standard. Don't you think it should be equal? Don't you think it should be even Steven?" Okay. Well, you just say, okay, yeah, fine. Okay, you can have a sex with as many guys as you want, and I can have a sex with as many girls as I want. That's my innate male mating strategy. Well, come on over to my way of thinking. That's great. You can go and have sex with as many guys as you want to, and be as promiscuous as you want to. And lo and behold, the statistics show that women who have more than, like, say, 4 or 5 sex partners in their lifetime have a higher incidence of divorce, have a lower incidence of healthy emotional connections in the long term with their marriages, or to be happier in marriage and such. And the more that they have, the less happy they tend to be. And
did you also know that there's significantly higher, I think the rate was twice as high, substance abuse issues with high notch counts. Also, borderline personality disorder is directly correlated with a high notch count as well. So there's a price to pay.
Why would that be true, though? That's a question, because a lot of guys will say, well, they'll use those stats, and I see this all the time, particularly
those are the studies. I mean,
they'll use those stats to back up their own whatever ideological thing. But I always ask this: you're not digging deep enough. Why would that be the case? And why would it be the case that for men, it doesn't make any difference? It's not there's no correlation between a higher divorce count or a higher incidence of divorce or relationship.
Men do in fact self-report lower levels of marital satisfaction if they have a higher notch count, but it's not nearly as bad as women. Right. And women don't suffer from dependency issues with substance abuse like women do with a high notch count. So there is a significant difference there. I mean, hey, maybe there's something there. Maybe women should preserve their value and their beauty and their sexuality. It's kind of,
well, that's the moral, that's sort of like the social convention side of it. Like, well, if that's the case, then maybe we should have some rules for women that don't necessarily apply to guys. Well, that's the problem, though, because now we throw in the blank slate, right? Well, we should all be equal. So women should be able to do whatever a guy does, and a guy should be able to do whatever a woman does, right? Because we have equal potential, and it's all a social construct. Well, guess what? We're finding out more and more and more that it's not a social construct, and that yes, biological determinism, or at least biological evolutionary influences, influence our decision-making process, what it is we do, why are we attracted to certain things, why do we want to do certain things. Because
Chris Eric, just real quick, let me hit that super chat. Chris Van Eric says, stats show guys lose when you have even Steven scenario. Hey, Rich and Rollo, thanks, brother. He's right. I mean, there's got to be differences between the sexes. I mean, there's visual differences right away, right off the bat. You can't, I mean, you can, if you want to walk around life thinking that men and women are equal and the same, and we should just manufacture ways for them to be the same. I mean, there's so many things that, like, since I've read your first book and I've started to like pay a little more attention to things, I see and hear things every single day. It's like one day it's, well, the California Board of Business and Trade says that there's not enough female board members, so they're going to set a quota for the number of female board members on certain types of companies and blah, blah, blah. And it's like, okay, well, why are we doing that? You know, why? Because a few people are saying that it's not fair. I mean, don't you have to earn your right to sit at a board table? Don't you have to like do some work? Or is it just because you were born with different body parts from me that you get some preferential treatment?
I think I think you were on my show when we were talking about the differences in respect and the differences in concepts of respect.
Yeah.
Like when I talk about, and everybody knows me for this, is that I point out the differences in men and women's concept when it comes to love. Men tend to approach love more idealistically. Women,
that was the other thing. Can you hit on that too?
Yeah, for sure. And that's only one aspect. That's a difference. That is a psychological difference between men and women. Is men tend to think love should exist for the sake of love, like it's an idealistic kind of thing, whereas women don't make emotional investments in men unless they check off enough of their hypergamous checklist, right? And so there's an opportunistic side to it. And whether, a woman can be very much emotionally invested in that guy, but that guy doesn't get to that part unless he checks off a lot of those, the hypergamous checklist, what Royce used to call the 436 bullet point checklist for women. Yeah. And so there's another double standard. I mean, I can go double standard toe for toe. There are probably more double standards for men than there are for women.
Guys have two prerequisites to fall in love. She gives me attention and she has sex with me. Women, you're right. They've got that 432 point checklist before they'll emotionally invest head over heels.
Yeah. That's
why we end up with so many guys with an unhealthy attachment to women with one-itis, right?
Yeah. In one of the, I don't know if it was a TED talk or it might have been a college talk that Dr. Pinker gave, and he was talking about at least 6 different fundamental differences between the sexes, and these were like from a psychological perspective. And one, I think it was like number 2 or 3, was men tend to focus on things. They tend to be interested in things. Women tend to be more interested in people. And you can see that reflected in the decisions and the directions that women want to go in their life. And that also correlates with women's ability to, like, their higher proclivity for communication and things like that. So you have men who tend to be more idealistic. And this is sort of correlates with what I've always said about guys, is guys are looking outward. They're looking at how they can impose their will on the world. So, and I use this example as like, I see a river. What would that look like with a bridge across it? Then when I wonder what's beyond that. And it's sort of this idea of imposing your will on the world. Whereas for women, it is not so much imposing will, but it is dealing with people more. And if you look at our hunter-gatherer beginnings, women had to be more focused on the collective, whereas men had to be more focused on merit. Like who killed the woolly mammoth, right? Or who did the best job. And so when you look, and we see this reflected, of course, in our businesses today, which is we see old school businesses, old order businesses that became successful were successful because they were based on a male dynamic, they were male spaces, and it was all about profit, and it was all about doing a good job. And it's like, it was very hierarchical. If you look at modern American businesses that have sort of invested themselves in the feminine imperative right now, they tend to be more collectivist. So it's not so much, I mean, they want to make profit, obviously, to keep the businesses going, but it's the convenience and the comfort of the women that are, or the employees and the women that are in that business tends to be something of a greater focus now. So now we have to have daycare, and we've got to have, pregnancy leaves. And I'm not saying those are necessarily bad ideas. I'm just saying that's where the focus goes when you have those. So you've got women tend to be more collectivist, men tend to be more meritorious, meritocracy kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And those are differences between men. Is it fair? No. In some cases it might be, in some cases it might not be. And that's where a lot of guys, or a lot of certainly women and guys who think like women, sort of lose the narrative, because they think that if something is advantageous to a guy, then it is immediately sexist, or it is immediately misogynist. Whereas if it benefits the feminine, then it's the right thing, and it's the correct thing to be, and the correct thing to do. And so you get these guys, like we were looking at today in Zuby's thread, where people will come up and they will say, well,
do you have the thread? Do you want to throw it up?
Yeah, I mean, it's not all that great a thread, to be honest, but it's okay. Like the comments are great. And I'll throw this out there. Zuby just says, I don't know why so many people are resistant to the fact that men and women are different. This had 753 retweets, and it had almost 7,000 likes right now. I wouldn't say it's viral, but people want to talk about this kind of stuff. And for the most part, a lot of these, it was sort of like boys against girls, right? Yeah. Whereas women think, I think one of the big mistakes that most people get, and this is usually from their upbringing, and this is from their socialization and their acculturation, is if something is good for the goose, it should be good for the gander. And that's not necessarily the truth, because men and women are different. So yes, when women have multiple sex partners, they tend to do worse than men, because men can dissociate themselves from it, because that's just how we are. That's how we were made. That's how we evolved. So when guys, you want to know why guys have such a problem with pornography? Well, pornography appeals to men's mating strategy, which is unlimited access to unlimited sexuality. For women, it is, women's sexuality is cyclic. And it's something that, if you know anything about ovulatory shift, which I think you do, it goes through cycles where a woman is more interested, and she's in her proliferative phase, and she's less interested in sex in her luteal phase. So, and those are just, parts of it. I mean, it's more complicated than that, but there are differences in the way that we approach sex and mating, because that's ultimately what sex is about. But the problem that when we talk about, when we have these arguments or these debates, it's always about what's fair.
Is that pursuit of fairness, is that pursuit of blank slate equalism a good thing?
Well, you can make a case for it, and I try to.
There's a warm heart, touchy feely, pull on the heartstrings sort of reason behind it. I get it, but is it a good thing?
Well, I've made this case for a very long time now, is that we live in a feminine primary social order, a gynocentric social order, and as a result of that, anything that benefits a female or benefits the feminine or in any way empowers women is always the correct answer. So you will see, I'm sure you get this all the time too. Like if you make a point, and you've done this before, where you say, well, women with tattoos are less, let's just say, desirable than women without tattoos.
Yeah.
Or if you place any kind of conditions on like standards that men should have for women, well, women lose their minds, of course, but you'll also see a lot of guys that what we would call manginas, right? The beta males will pipe up, and they'll say, well, what about guys? What about guys? What about? Or if you say something that is, and this is, I could go do this right now. We can do this live on the air right now. I could go on Twitter, and I could type in some unflattering aspect of female nature. Yeah. And within the first, I'd say 3 or 4, retweets or counter tweets or whatever, somebody's going to say, well, what about guys? Or guys do it too. Yeah. And guys do it worse. Yeah. And it's always this kind of redirection of whatever the initial point was. So if it's unflattering to the feminine, we've got to find an equal and opposite reaction in the masculine. But if you, of course, if you say something that's unflattering about men's nature, everybody piles on, because, and even men will pile on because they think that if they do,
like, what's an example of that? So let's use the whole tattoo thing, because tattoos to me are not attractive. I see it as a way of putting bumper stickers all over a Lambo. It's just not it's not a feminine approach to beauty, is what my view is. And then people will say, well, what about men when men get tattoos? Well, men are kind of more tribal in nature, and we've always sort of had tattoos, and it's also a rite of passage in a lot of cultures as well too. Whereas this phenomenon of inking the female body is relatively new. It's not something that's been around for a long time, right? So what's an example of something that women would do a lot of that nobody piles in and says, well, men do it, or like, what about men?
Right. Well,
when I heard it.
Right. Well, when we talk about, usually it's something that's flattering to the feminine, right? If it's negative to the guys, nobody says, well, women do that too. Like if it's something that is negative about the masculine or I don't want to cast it in like terms of positive and negative. I want to cast it in like flattering or unflattering, because that's what people feel like they need to defend.
So what's something unflattering that men do that somebody would pile in, or, the outrage mob would pile in and say, well, women do it too?
Well, you could say, I mean, you could even just turn around the sex thing, right? Well, all men are dogs, or all men are pigs, or no, men aren't loyal, or here's a good one. Guys will criticize other guys for being infantile, right? For being we're prolonging their adolescence. Let's just say, like guys who aren't manning up, guys who aren't preparing for the future, and you'll say something like, well, the guys today don't know how to be men, and they're not preparing themselves to get a good job or go to school or whatever. And usually what happens is like guys will say, particularly more tradcon guys will say, well, that's just because their dads brought them up wrong or something like that, or they don't want to be real men. They're prolonging their kidults, right? They're prolonging their adolescence.
Peter Pan. They're
Peter Pan boys, right? So there is something that women do. They do the exact same thing. They prolong, getting it. I was just talking about.
Well, women are praised when they prolong,
right,
or put off getting married or having kids.
See, nobody says that, though.
She's so strong and independent.
So if I say, if I come down on some guy who's 28 years old and I go, how come you don't have a house yet? How come you don't have a car yet? How come you don't have a career yet? How come you're not married yet? How come you or like if I criticize it, particularly MGTOWs, man, if you say something like that, well, I'm going to live the way that I want to, and maybe they're rightfully so, but you will hear the criticism be, they're not living up, they're not manning up, they're not doing what society expects them to do. And as a result, or the reason for that, they naturally think is because they just want to be Peter Pan, right? They want to prolong the magic as much as they can and shirk their responsibilities. When women do the same thing, nobody says, honey, you're shirking your responsibility. Or God forbid anybody says, how old are you now? 28. You should have had at least 2 kids by now. How come you're not married? How come you, like, if you were to say that to a woman, you could probably get slapped with sexual harassment or something, like by saying, how come you don't have any kids? You're 30 years old.
I feel like families do that, but the societal narrative doesn't. The media doesn't. The narrative is go out and get those degrees, smash the patriarchy, smash the corporate, ceiling, climb the ladder, and have your kids when you're 39.
Well, that's I'm going to call up my essay on double standards here. Hang on. Yeah, but that's the narrative, though, is if a woman does it, she's focusing on her career. If a woman isn't married and doesn't have kids by the time she's 30 years old, nobody blinks an eye at that today because they think she's empowered, right? She's doing what society wants her to do. She's focusing on her career. I was doing an essay one time on why women freeze their eggs right now, and that was it's actually a benefit that a lot of Fortune 500 companies are offering to women who are middle management.
Yeah, I heard this.
because they'll say, well, you know what, you're focusing on your career. Don't worry about it, honey. We'll freeze your eggs. And so when you finally get to a point in your life where you're financially stable or whatever, you'll be okay. You'll have your eggs and you won't have to worry about it. Well, if you follow the research and you follow the stats, most women, it's not about their career. It's about finding the right guy. It's about the guy because the entitlements and the expectations are so high right now that they will never find that right guy. Okay, so, but if I said that as a guy, like I was talking to guys, I did a show yesterday about what killed marriage. And so I had guys who were asking me, like, I'm 37 years old. All of my brothers are married, and my mom and my dad are coming down on me because they think that I'm juvenile, right? I'm still trying to relive my youth or something, or I'm shirking my responsibilities as a real man, and yada yada yada, all of this shame.
That's pretty standard. My brother's 8 years younger than me, and he gets that all the time from my mom, right?
Right. And so there's this, this family thing, but that's a double standard right there, because no one would say the same thing of a woman. And if you did, you would be the person who is saying, how come you're not married? How come you don't have kids? Why are you going to be a spinster? Nobody says those things because
not anymore.
We explained it away by saying, well, she's a femme-powered alpha female climbing her way up the corporate ladder.
Hashtag girl power.
Exactly. And that's a fantasy that we have, or that's this myth that we think is going on. It's not really going on, but that's a good example of a double standard that is not based on, or I should say, is not based on the blank slate. So
I've got one here for you.
Difference.
So men are generally viewed as success objects, and women are generally viewed as beauty or sex objects. Now, when you say that, women and white knights will pile in and get mad. Well, why? Why does it have to be that way? Why can't women be viewed as success objects instead? Why are we just like pretty things?
Right. Well, first of all, the reason for that is, again, biological determinism. It's our evolved, the way what we value as men is not the same thing that women value. Guys will give me this all the time. Like you of course probably have seen my infamous graph on when women, their sexual market value peak.
S&P graph,
yeah, 23 years old men, right about 36 to 38 years old. So what do you think? Like the first criticism right out the gate, like, and I wasn't even only half serious when I put this thing together. It has become more serious over the years, but women and men were like, well, I don't see any 23-year-old girls getting with 37-year-old guys. I'm like, that right there is the perfect example of blank slate thinking. Is you think that because I said that women are, there you go, because that women, yeah, exactly. Women
peak of females about 23, peak of males late 30s.
Yeah, late 30s and mid to late 30s somewhere around. If you have,
is this a graph that you actually created?
Yeah, I created it a long time ago. Is that I did it for an essay one time.
That's got your logo on the bottom there.
Yeah, that's me. It was I did it in response to everybody telling me like when they thought women were at their best, right? And as I progressed through the years, I had people show me like things from like OkCupid that back this up, right? There's OkCupid stats where they have petitioned or they polled men from, boys as young as 15 all the way up to like 70 or 80 years old, asking them when they found women the most attractive or like what age. And at every one of those ages, from
regardless of age,
said 22, 23, right around there. Did not change. So I felt kind of vindicated once I put that out there, because I got shit for that. But so I made that, and then the initial criticism was, well, I don't see 23-year-old girls getting with 38-year-old guys. I go, yeah, because you're thinking in terms of blank slate. You think that if there's the binaries, like if I'm at my highest, I got to have the highest. No. And you're also thinking in terms of men and women are exactly the same, and they're attracted to exactly the same thing. They're aroused by exactly the same thing, and it's simply not true. So when you look at women, and you could adjust this for era, like if you went back in time, like 100 years, I might shift the the bell curves a little bit, but not by much. And so when I put that together, I understood what I was doing, but nobody else understood it, because I was saying, look, when men are 36, 37, 38 years old, that is their peak potential years. So the things that make a man most attractive are usually when he's hitting his stride, when he has the most sexual selectivity. It's right around those times. For women, it's right around like 23 years old, 24 years old, and 22 years old, somewhere around there, because they have what men want the most at that time. That's what makes them the most sexually desire, or the most, their sexual market value peak. From terms of like mating and dating, that's what men want. They want that holy grail of the 22-year-old or 23-year-old. For women, it's different, because women have different requirements for what they want as their idealized male. And so like guys would say, well, I'm 24 years old and I'm way better shape than any 38-year-old guy, right? That might be true, but the guy who's 38 has more things that make him attractive in the long term. But again, people kept thinking that it has to be even Steven, that it has to be, well, if women are into this, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. And they can't break out of that, because they've been taught from a very early age that we're blank slates, that we're gender is a social construct. Men and women are all the same except for the plumbing. There's no real differences. And the differences that are there are so insignificant that we shouldn't even think about those things. And that's how you get when guys will say, well, men do it too, or women do it too. Ooh, men do it too. And they try to redirect it because they're stuck in blank slate thinking.
There is some gray area, which I want to paint here, because I do get criticized for being too black and white. So I was just thinking about it as you were laying that down. But there are times where men are viewed as beauty objects by women.
Absolutely.
There are times where a woman who has, the right time of the month, the right age, the right era for her, she's looked at a guy and said, oh my God, he's gorgeous. And she'll do anything to bang him. Like she'll bang him within 20 minutes of meeting him, and just view him as a beauty object and discard. And it's the same thing the other way around too, right? I mean, there are certain guys that will see some women as success objects, as a means to betterment. Not very often. On a balance of probabilities, men are generally success objects and women are generally viewed as beauty objects by men. And that's okay, because we're not the same.
Right.
How did these... Sorry.
No, when I get those, and hold that thought, when I get that a lot, like guys, like women, whenever they throw out the men just see women as sex objects. And my answer to that is always, yes, we do. That's how our brains work. And again, we can go to like sort of New Order information society stuff, and we can look at the statistics and we can look at the research, and the research shows that when men see a half-naked woman, they see a centerfold, whatever, it triggers parts of their brain that is associated with tool use. Now, why is that? Well, because reproduction is a problem that men have to solve. I also can show you stats and research about how male brains tend to, and this is not just humans, but like male brains in general, in the animal kingdom, prioritize sex above food, above sustenance. So the prime directive of, well, pretty much every animal on planet Earth is to reproduce, if it even at the cost of its own life. That's what we're thinking. So yes, we do. And when men see women for the first time, or they see a half-naked woman, they process that woman in terms of parts, like her cooter, right, her legs, her butt, her breasts, right, and there's a priority to it as well. And
there are animals out there in the animal kingdom that do expire after reproduction. Like we know certain spiders, I think even praying mantises will eat their mate after they mate, but it's not the male eating the female, it's the female eating the male.
Right. Because and again, that is the prime directive, particularly for males of any, well, certainly higher order species, but so yes, we do. I'm sorry if that why is that offensive to women? I want to be treated as a human. I want to be treated as an equal. Well, the reason why you're offended is because you still subscribe to blank slate equalism. There are certain ways that men are not going to be equal with women and women are not going to be equal with men. It all depends on the context and it all depends on the environment and what's the challenge that's being presented to us. So when women say, well, when we talk about like dominance and submission in relationships, women hate the word submission because they've been taught that that means inferior. That means you're
how dare you please a man?
How dare you, right? It's a sign of male chauvinism, right? Or supremacism. Even if you talk about those things. And so we've been taught over the course of the last like 50 some odd years that the ideal relationship between men and women is as egalitarian equals. And again,
that's what I grew up on. I drank that Kool-Aid for a long time.
I did too. And I thought that was the way. I think most guys do this, particularly most blue pill guys. And remember, I'm Gen X, so this is back in the 80s. I used to think that you got to be friends with them first, and you gotta treat them as equals, and we're all even Steven, man. I would never want to hold you down, baby. Or it was always you need to support the things that she likes and the things that she wants, and she doesn't at the expense of yours. And so what I thought was interesting, and again, this is something that's in book 4, is that egalitarianism only works one way. It only works for women. It only works towards a quote unquote more equal society, but there's no such thing as equality. And that is a radical statement right there to say, like, and I've said this and it really pisses people off. I go, I don't believe in equality. And I don't mean that in terms of, I don't think we all would be, our best selves or equals. I believe that the idea of equality is bullshit because equality implies a vacuum. It implies that everything is the same. It implies that all the challenges that in this case, gender challenges are always going to be in a vacuum. And, men and women having equal potential and equal whatever are going to, respond to those challenges in this. If everything were equal, everybody would respond in the same way. And that's a tough thing that a lot of social.
We're not I don't think there's any species on Earth that is biologically wired for equalism. It's always been survival of the fittest.
In fact, that's the death of a species.
Yeah.
What happens is, and this, I got this from, I have promiscuity around here from Tim Burke, but that's usually what happens is when a species gets to androgyny, when there's no, or homogeny, I think when it gets to homogeneous societies die because they have no ability to adapt to a changing situation, to a changing environment, whether that's social or it's like physical or whatever else. If all of the members of one species are exactly the same and they have no real ability to change or to adapt, that species goes extinct.
Or they become asexual.
They become and that too. But that it leads to stagnation, and it usually leads to the extinction of that species. You're not gonna. Okay, so that's the biological side of it, and then like you were asking before, like what was, what are some criticisms of this? Like, shouldn't I asked this in the book? I said, shouldn't we strive to be more equal? Like, if we're not equals,
I think that we should strive to be better.
Should we strive to be more equal? Because that's where you're going to get, that's most of the counter arguments are going to be, well, Rich, we're not animals. Rich, we're not, we're above that.
Okay. So that's the argument, but here's where it goes wrong, where I'm going to put on my business hat is they're striving for equality of outcome without doing the work, right? Mm-hmm. It's like, let's just give it we're actually trying to do this right now. Here in Canada, we've got Justin Trudeau giving everybody a decent chunk of money because we're quarantined. And there's quite a few people that are getting more sitting at home on their ass doing no work than what they did getting up, going to work every day and doing the work to earn that paycheck. So you run into problems. And I think they just pumped out a survey today on in the UK, but there's a large percentage of the UK. I think it was only 4% of the people surveyed that wanted to go back to work. The rest of them wanted the quarantine to remain simply because they were getting paid well to sit at home.
Yeah. Why do anything? Why challenge? Why do anything at all? Right. You and I have probably, well, certainly Ryan too, but you and I have probably dealt with the concept of like MGTOW and just sort of, I don't even call it MGTOW, like just sort of dropping out, like the juice ain't worth the squeeze.
Yeah.
Right? You still want the juice, but you don't want to do what you have to do to get to that juice. Well, the problem with that is it leads to stagnation. And so, what's worth doing, and why are you doing what you are doing? Now, what, like when you're talking about, like Justin Trudeau, for example, he's giving out, let's just keep the plebes happy, right? It's bread and circuses, right? We gotta do what we have to do to keep everybody, but what happens though is you don't challenge them. It's like if you had kids, you have a daughter, I have a daughter. I'm sure you probably have run into these situations where as a father, you want to give them everything. I want, if I could, I would give my daughter every last thing she wants, but I know that is the worst thing I can do. And that's I should say that's a Pook quote too, is like the surest way to make a woman miserable is to give her everything that she wants. Why? Well, because it doesn't inspire women to do anything. It doesn't inspire, like for men, like pornography is sedation, right? They don't have to do anything. All I do is jerk off. I get exactly the same feeling and I can move on with my day or whatever. Mm-hmm. It doesn't inspire them to channel that frustration or channel that creativity, I guess, towards other things that might get them to solving their reproductive problem. So I would love to be able to give my daughter everything, but I know that I shouldn't do that because she won't learn anything. She won't grow if everything is made easy for her. Now, for a lot of guys, they don't have that problem. Like I bust my ass and, come up from like having nothing to being where I'm at right now. That's, men's sort of journey of like, what is it? The hero's journey, right? You have to become like men become, women just are. Yeah. And there's another double standard. There's another, difference between men and women, but
what's different narrative is that men need to become and women just need to preserve, right?
Right. Well, what we do, like, are you familiar with the WNBA, like the women's basketball league here in the United States? It came out a while ago. I think it came out in the 90s, like the late 90s, mid to late 90s. And if I'm correct, I'm probably wrong. Somebody will correct me, but there was
I think there's a famous MGTOW guy that used to coach women's basketball that failed at that.
I think so too.
Yeah.
Well, when it first came out, and even today, it still struggles with like any kind of viewership or any kind of attendance to these things. But it was supposed to be this big, finally women have their own basketball league, and it ended up being a lot of pretty much butch lesbians playing basketball below the net, and it wasn't exciting.
Did they lower the net height?
No, but they did in the beginning to make it more exciting. They proposed lowering the nets so that women could dunk, right? So that at least or the majority of them could. I mean, there's women who could, but not very many. Just to sort of spice things up, so people will go, all right, we can watch a slam dunk. These are incredible. But the problem is it changes the nature of the game, and that is, I think, what is dangerous about giving people what they want. Because now you've changed the nature of the game. It's no longer basketball, it's women's basketball. And because women can't dunk like Michael Jordan, because they're physically unable to do those things, then now we're going to change the game and we're going to change the rules so that women can play this game.
This is a rule set that they've changed in other areas too. I read somewhere in the last couple of years, a military had lowered the requirement for grenade throwing for women. And as you know, when you pull the pin on a grenade, it's a frag. It's got an explosive and shrapnel goes everywhere. And if you don't get the grenade far enough, you could actually hurt yourself and your own crew. But they actually lowered the requirement that women had to pass to throw the grenade. It was something like a 30% reduction.
They did the same thing. I don't know if they did. Was that in Canada? Because I know they did something.
No, it was somewhere in Europe. I can't remember where, but they've got this narrative getting pushed at everywhere. It's kind of like that basketball story where it's like, okay, if they can't dunk, we'll just lower the net. If we don't have enough women on the board of directors in the California state of blah 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 blah, then we'll just put them in there. Sort of thing. We'll just promote them in there. So they carve out these special exclusions because they want the equality of outcome, but they're not letting them do the same work. They're getting preferential treatment.
Right. What I said about how I don't believe in equality, right? Well, because equality in the way that most blank slate equalist people believe it requires a vacuum. It requires everything to be the same all the time, and that there are no other challenges. That's why I keep saying, men and women are complements to each other. We're not equals of each other. So whatever that challenge is, like for instance, isn't it so unfair that Rollo Tomassi can't have a baby? Well, if that's the challenge, I am inferior to women because I don't have a uterus and I can't incubate the next generation. Okay. So isn't that horribly unfair? You don't see men, marching on Washington, D.C. for the right to, have uteruses implanted in them or whatever. We don't get those things.
Well, right now, anyway.
Right now,
I would say it's not going to happen.
But so what's the challenge? The challenge is dunking a basketball. Well, women have a lot of real difficulty with that. We see, like right now, sort of this clash of realities in that we want to believe that gender is a social construct, and so now we're going to allow transgender, basically physiologically men, compete with women in women's sports, whether it's wrestling or whatever it is, and
women don't like that now. Now they're starting to protest.
Right. Well, why would that be?
Because they're biologically male,
and women are different.
Yeah.
And it's conflicting with, that's a really good example right now, is that it conflicts with the idea of the blank slate. So while women get upset about that, and we don't want them in here, we can't have that, it's ruining the sport, it's ruining the game. It's okay for us to lower the baskets for women to dunk, but it's not okay to have a biological man on a wrestling mat with a woman, because he will always dominate because he simply has more body strength. Gender is not a social construct. It is there is a certain physical element that goes along with that as well. And so what happens is you have this sort of, when worlds collide, right? So you have this idea of social constructionism clashing with the realities of biological determinism. And they don't like that, because not only is it a pain in the ass to have to wrestle a real man on the mat, it's also a pain in the ass to wrestle the ideological implications of that, because they really, really want it to be. It really has to work. And why? Because we built society on that blank slate ideal for at least the last 50 years. And now they don't know what to do with it. And so you can say, well, if gender is a social construct, then why do we have to put hormone blockers in little boys to make them little girls? Well, it's not all up here. It's right here.
Let me ask you this question. So I got a talking point here on how lies lead to unhealthy attachments.
Okay.
I also put 2 women, but we can speak generally, or with both genders if you'd like, but we've probably, the most obvious one that I've seen the most often is men having an unhealthy attachment to one woman because they believe in a soulmate myth. They believe that if they emotionally invest, or they put relationship equity into a relationship, they buy a house in the neighborhood that she wants to live in, he renovates the bathroom the way that she wants it, they finish the basement, and the mother-in-law moves in, that he will have her undying love, commitment, and affection till kingdom come, so on and so forth. And that doesn't always work out that way. And when people have those, when men specifically who have subscribed to lies that don't serve them have those beliefs broken, you end up with a man in a very, very bad position. Like, it creates, part of the reason why you started doing what you were doing, you told us from the very get-go, was your brother-in-law committed suicide based on beliefs that he had, in a relationship that he basically created a covert contract in his head on, right?
Right. Yeah, it was, a lot of guys get that, I think. And there's a few ideals that you have to sort of mix into all that, like what the expectations are of a man of himself when it comes to women. So you have a social order that teaches men an old order way of thinking, which is you need to serve men or serve women. You need to be useful. You need to provide protection. You need to provide, provisioning. You need to be parentally invested. You have to, in some way, meet her needs. We hear that all the time. And my needs aren't getting met, right? It's usually a woman who's saying that. I wasn't meeting my needs. So there's the social aspect of it. There's also a religious aspect of it, but also there is the biological part of that, which is men have an innate proclivity to want to protect women. And we get, we see guys like, or did you see that that one video of that guy in the nightclub who tried to break up the fight between this guy and his girlfriend, and he thought it was going to get violent or something, and he tried to step in between the two of them, and the boyfriend shot the guy who was trying to come between them. And the guy who was the beta white knight died right there on the floor, and the girl goes with the guy, and they leave the club together. And
I didn't see that, but I've seen versions of that. Yeah.
So I got into, it was a very long Twitter thread about this, and a lot of men and a lot of women were saying he did the right thing. He died. Dying and sacrificing himself in that situation was the right thing for him to do.
Well, men are disposable, aren't they?
Okay, so yes, you're right. Why are they disposable? Because sperm is cheap and eggs are expensive. That's the biological side of being useful. What's the ultimate use for men? To die for the incubators of the next generation. To die it's kin associative altruism is what it is. Men are supposed to die in order for their women and their children to live on. And that's something that has been really sort of a species dynamic for human beings for a long time. Well, primates in general, and then other organisms do the same thing. Right? The male tends to be the disposable sex. He's the one that takes the bullet for the rest of them, so that his genetics can go on. Like we were saying before, they prioritize sex above food. I will starve to death so long as I know that my sperm is going in there and it's going on to the next generation. I'll have served my purpose. There is an aspect where men have an innate protector instinct when it comes to women and when it comes to children as well. So what happens is society, and certainly a feminine primary social order, takes that and uses that against men and against men's interests. So
this would be an interesting kind of conversation topic to have with Craig, Abu American, because Joe Rogan made a pretty funny joke about how men are more than willing to strap dynamite to themselves and blow themselves up to get whatever it is, 70 or 80 virgins in a past life. But there's no such equivalent for women. You don't see women doing that.
Women don't kill themselves for dick.
Yeah, women. Dick is abundant. Yeah,
you don't see women strapping, explosives to themselves for the promise of dick in another dimension.
Yeah, but men will do the weirdest things, and when that social, like when that contract that they manufacture in their head is not executed on it, if it doesn't carry its weight, then they go sideways pretty quickly and pretty badly. I mean, one-itis is a pretty debilitating. Like I've talked to a lot of guys now that have had one-itis, and every time I feel like, wow, this guy's got a serious case. Mm-hmm. It can't possibly get worse. There's somebody else that comes along that has something worse.
Yep. They're willing to sacrifice themselves, their ambitions, their lives, because they think that is their key to solving the reproductive problem. I mean, ultimately, I'm not saying that they're going, wow, I could really have babies with her. No, that's not what's first and foremost, but the latent purpose of wanting to sacrifice all that is because of a false belief that if they do, that it will be rewarded, it will be appreciated. It's the Captain Save-A-Ho dynamic, right? It's the savior schema is what I call it. It's like if you go and you save the woman, and you'll see this in like classic literature, in poetry, in music, in art, where the knight in shining armor saves the woman, the damsel in distress, from the evil dragon that's about to eat her, kills it. Maybe he gets jacked up in the process, and then to show her appreciation for saving her life, she lives happily ever after with him, with the prince who was brave enough to slay the dragon for her. And that, again, what is that? It's the protector dynamic. It's the guy who thinks that if I protect this woman, that will translate into me being able to solve my and we'll call it love, we'll call it romance. We'll dress it up in lots of different ways.
Oh, that's true love.
That's true love, right? But the fact of the matter is that it's still following that biologic, that we can only see these things in terms of like how we are as human beings. So isn't it unfair? Let me ask you this. Isn't it unfair and totally a double standard that men have to sacrifice, them, are expected to die to sacrifice their ultimate claim to any kind of power, which is, the direction of their own lives? Isn't it so totally unfair that we have a biological instinct that prompts us to do that? Wow, seems like a really bad double standard to me.
But men are more than happy to march off to war and, try to dodge bullets, right?
Right. Well, and then so here's the other thing is like just me saying that and just you saying what you just did right there, that makes you sound like a pussy. Right.
Does it though?
That sounds like you're saying, well, if you talk about these things, and I get this all the time, particularly from tradcons, is if you point things out like I just did, I said, oh boy, isn't it terrible and horrible for guys? Guys are victims. That's the first thing they'll say is like, well, you think that men are victims? And
did we say that though?
Yeah, they actually kind of are.
Yeah.
Like if I say that, it makes me sound like less of a man because I'm complaining. Men are not allowed to complain. Women can complain all they want to, but men are allowed to complain. There's another double standard for you right there.
Yeah, we don't have that privilege as men. That's why the MRA movement doesn't really work, because you're not allowed to complain as a man.
And never will. And you want to know why the best, most outspoken, most well-known figureheads of the MRA are feminist women?
Yeah.
Because only women are allowed to say those things. Only women can make the case for men, because if men do, they sound like pussies.
Correct. Andrew K says, thanks for the super chat, by the way. How to respond when your friends shame you for pointing out differences between men and women?
Well, just here's what I do is I just say, you're going to I don't like when guys say, well, you're shaming me. Like I get this all the time. Like how come you're using female tactics? That's shaming. It's like, no, shaming works for men and women and children and even dogs sometimes too, if you really are imaginative. Shaming is not a male or a female thing, but we tend to think of it, particularly from guys, we tend to think of it in terms of like, well, if I'm shaming you for something, like a lot of guys will assume that sometimes tough love or a sharp kick in the ass or some kind of discipline, they can't separate that from bullying and they can't separate that from shaming. So what do you do? Well, what I would do is say, look, are you going to give me grief for basically pointing these things out? Here's a really good recent example. I had a guy, what was it? Did you see the story on the new Monopoly game, which is Ms. Monopoly?
Yeah.
And it's all about, well, she gets $1,900 and male players get $1,200 to balance out the gender or whatever it is. And it's this big narrative about Ms. Monopoly got her money from her rich uncle, who was the guy who created a regular Monopoly. And I'm like, oh, so and I pointed this out because everybody was like up in arms and just praising this new game. And I go, oh, so she's following in the footsteps of pretty much every major female CEO or every of the richest women on planet Earth. All of them either got their money through divorce or they got it through an inheritance. They're not self-made millionaires. They got to where they are as a result of a divorce, or somebody died and they took over the company. And people lost their shit. They're like, this is the worst take I ever seen, blah, blah, blah. And I'm going, so you're going to give me grief.
So there's your shaming.
Pointing out that's the shame. Yeah. And I say, you're going to give me grief for pointing out the truth. I said, what? So come back with, what's your counter argument?
Exactly. Like, I get this, right? Because my family gives me this crap all the time. When we have get-togethers, I'll say something and then I'll get a response, which is some sort of shaming tactic. Rich, you hate women, you're a misogynist, blah, 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 something like that. And it's like, okay, I've just pointed to a fact. Where's the discrepancy with the fact? Because they don't have one. It's just what you're saying that they have an issue with, because most people are socially programmed to dislike hearing anything that shines a unflattering light on the feminine, right?
I think I talked about this with Ryan, but I wrote an essay called "The Believers versus the Empiricists," and usually when you get into those arguments, when it comes to like somebody's really ego invested beliefs in something, it doesn't have to be religious. I mean, it can be political. It can be about intersexual dynamics. It can be what your perspective is on gender. is just as much a belief and is just as much of an ego investment as anything else. But what happens is guys don't argue from the perspective of what is. They want to tell you what should be. And that's the difference between a believer and an empiricist. Is the empiricist is arguing from the perspective of let's hash out what is actually going on, whereas the believer wants to question, first of all, why you're even asking these things, because usually the data that the empiricist is looking for will counter the belief of the believer. And so the believer casts the debate in terms of right or wrong. So that's why you get shame. That's why would you shame a child? Well, that's wrong. That's wrong behavior, and I want you to change your behavior. Well, in this term, it's like that's wrong belief, and I want you to change your belief. But here's the data. Here's the empirical data. Doesn't matter. It should be this or it should be that way. I'm going to shame you for thinking or even asking those questions or even connecting those dots. I get this all the time, as you might guess. Just connecting the wrong dots or asking the wrong questions means I'm a heretic. It means I'm bad for coming up with it.
Yeah, terrible, Rollo Tomassi. You're such a fraud. We got to wrap up in the next 10 minutes.
Sure.
Doing a show for my community after this. So let's take it out on this note. So why must men make themselves their own mental point of origin? Like, why is this such a danger for guys to believe in blank slate equalism?
Well, I think that there's a want to believe that we have evolved above our base natures. Like I was asking this before, the next question is this, is even if you can accept the fact that biology and evolution and just the way you are as a human, a physical, visceral human is, even if that's the case, then aren't we, you can say this, are we spiritually, have we raised ourselves above this, or even intellectually? So it's either spiritual or intellectual. Aren't we smarter than this? Aren't we better than this? So even if men and women aren't equals, even if men and women are biologically complements to each other, shouldn't the ideal be to make a more equal and equitable, egalitarian society? And the fact that, and we can also point to research in this, is that even in countries and in social states where that's the case, men and women still opt for their conventional gender roles. They still opt for what their biology and what their evolution has influenced them or prompts them to, because those are their natural strengths. So I've always been of this opinion, is that I think that we will live happier, healthier lives. And I don't want to say that we should just simply deny, what we think of as our higher selves. But I also think that we don't do ourselves any favor by thinking that's all there is, right? Or just I think there needs to be sort of a balance between like our visceral selves and what we are and what we can be, or what our potential is, or what our ideal. I mean, like I said, men are idealists, right? What could be. So when I lock horns with a guy like Jeffrey Miller or something like that, he loves to say, well, he lives a certain lifestyle. He does the things that he does because he's intellectually above his base nature. And so he can enjoy himself. But I've always said, but it doesn't exclude you from that. Or like when I talk to MGTOWs, and MGTOWs say, well, I'm just not going to deal with it anymore. I'm not going to do, I'm out. Forget it. I'm exempt from the game. No, you're not. As long as you're alive and you're living in a human body, you're not exempt from that game. So when it comes to making yourself your mental point of origin, I think you need to also understand there is a balance between sort of your visceral nature and what makes you a human being. Like when you're in the squat rack and you have, the weight of a small car on the back of your neck, you want that animal nature. You need that to survive. And when we get into like survival situations and stuff, you better damn well be glad that you have testosterone and you can turn into that animal when you need to. But I'm not saying that's the only thing. And I also don't think that you should just be this pie in the sky, like, oh, we're going to sun our buttholes, right? Or we're going to, believe in crystals and MBTI and all this other, fantasy shit. And if that's all you're thinking about, I'm not saying don't think about those things, but if that's the only thing that is informing your decisions, I would say you're living a pretty imbalanced way of an imbalanced life. Yeah. So when I talk about mental point of origin, I think of it in terms of sort of making yourself the first part of any decision. Like if something, like when you have like new information is bombarding you, or you have to make a decision, or there's something that requires your immediate attention, your thought process should be, how is this affecting me? Not how is this going to affect my woman? How is this going to affect society? How is this going to affect my kids? How does it affect me first, and then deal with whatever else? Because most guys don't do that. And most guys, instead of making themselves their mental point of origin, like I said, they make their women their mental point of origin, or they make future women or potential women their mental point of origin. So if I do these things, will I be able to solve my reproductive problem? And I in this case, I tend to agree, and I've said this before, is that, you need to make yourself, really sort of the center of your world, but also not to make other things, whether that's women or that's sex or whatever else, the metric of your self-worth. You won't be doing that if you are the first thing that you're thinking about.
I'm going to add to that before we wrap up, guys. If you're putting women up on a pedestal, you're not subscribing to that whole mental point of origin concept. And you're never going to have a very good experience in life as a guy if you continuously subscribe to lies that don't serve. I get critics that'll say things like, well, Rich, what are we supposed to believe? Are women just all these like hypergamous sluts that are just going to leave you anyway? And what's the point? And it doesn't even matter. And if it happened to Brad Pitt and Rob Lowe, and they've got a list of all these names.
Binary thinking.
Yeah. Not alpha men, but handsome men that, got taken to the cleaners. Well, who's to say this can't happen to me, sort of thing. So there's that other side of the spectrum, but it's really just coming to the reality of the world that we live in and accepting uncomfortable truths for what they are, and just forgetting about the comforting lies. If it's not working, if it doesn't serve you, then adapt. It's as simple as that. It's a matter of, men need to be competent, guys. They need to be able to assess scenarios and adapt and respond accordingly. And if you've been doing something for a good chunk of your life that's not working, you're getting bad results with women, you're ending up in scenarios where you have one-itis, you're ending up in scenarios where you get taken to the cleaners, emotionally, economically, it doesn't matter what it is. This is why subscribing to lies is not good for you, right? And you should identify them as lies. I mean, you've got to develop some level of competency as a guy where you can figure out the truth from a lie. And it's really just watching what people do versus what they say. I mean, there's lots of things that we've talked about tonight. So
I think
we really hope that this broadcast helped.
When you're talking about, like, just back to, let's just finish this on the topic here. When it comes to like blank slate equalism, when it comes to when we ask, why is it that, why do we think that men and women ought to be equal? Why do we think that men and women, why is it such a controversial thing to say men and women are different? You need to ask yourself ask those questions. Sometimes it seems like, well, why is the sky blue, right? Well, why do you believe that men and women should be equal? Or why is your default belief that that men and women are not different, right? Why is it that it's a radical statement to say that men and women are different, are actually more different than they are alike? How did you get to those points? So whenever I'm approaching an essay or whenever I'm approaching an idea, I always kind of like try to get back to the very root of it. So what I was just saying a minute ago is, when it comes to like blank slate equalism, that goes against really what human nature is really about. We're not about equality. We're about overcoming certainly adversity, and we can be inspirational in all of that. But it's actually the fact that things aren't equal is what makes us better. It pushes us beyond the things that we thought that were possible for us. So when you have like, when we talk about, we want gender parity is not a goal to seek out. It's not something that we should be chasing after, or even thinking that it should exist. And so if I change my thinking about it, then suddenly something in the real world is going to change, when in fact, the idea of equality is flawed. The idea of blank slate equalism is flawed. And we know it is now because we have the evidence to show that it is. So where do we go from there? How do we go forward from that? And I've always said that I think that it's a difference between like dealing with what we are and what we think we could be, what's our, like as idealistic men. So what is the nature, what's your operative nature, and how are you going to change that, or how are you going to overcome your challenges that that environment gives to you with, thinking that you're better than that or improving yourself better than that. So those are some things to think about.
All right, I'm going to quickly have a quick moment to thank the channel sponsor. Scott from Grondike Soap's been a great supporter. Just tilt this a little bit this way. Tactical soap and beard oil. It's pheromone infused, handmade, and it's an all natural product that does not disrupt your endocrine system. So take a look at that. There's a link that'll be pinned in the top description if you're watching the replay. If you're listening to the podcast or you're just watching this right now, just go to coopersoap.com. The coupon code's already applied. If you're using the link below, use coupon code Cooper and you'll get 10% off. Real quick, let me grab the super chat before we go. So Mr. C had, ironically, a lot of guys that are categorized as jerks are really just putting themselves first and end up getting the girl because of that mentality. 100% true.
Right. Well, and think about why that is, because women viscerally respond to the guy who has those dark triad, personality traits that we would stereotypically call a jerk. What is it about that guy, or what is it about those traits that would make him preferable to the guy who is more accommodating, who is more,
arousal cues versus attraction cues,
well,
right?
Yeah, that too. But it's like, what is it about the dark triad traits or the jerk that would make him a better reproductive choice than the guy who is more amiable, who is the guy who goes along to get along, or the guy who is not as assertive?
Well, we know that agreeable guys have far less sex than disagreeable guys too, right?
Well, I mean, okay, but if we go and we say, well, it shouldn't matter about that, it should be what's on the inside that counts, man. That's really the best.
That's a lie.
But it should.
The sooner that you believe that's a lie, the better off you're going to be.
True. I don't understand why it's not true. Well, again, you're looking at a clash between natural world, the visceral self, versus like this fantasy idea. That's the thing, is we need to find a way of thinking that sort of aligns with what we know is going on. Just
start from this point. Take a look around. Take a look around the earth. Take a look around your country. Take a look around your school. Take a look around the freaking universe, the solar system. At what part of any of that is anything equal and perfectly balanced? It's not. There's always some level of something going on where there's a synergy that makes it work. So let it work. Is basically the message here. Let it work. All right. You want to give a quick shout out to any streams you're doing this week?
Oh, I'm just going to be on my channel on Wednesday. I will be doing it, I believe, at 2:00. I'm still kind of working out the times that I want to do it. I don't know what's the optimal time at this point. Like right now, I'm not working with Pat Campbell anymore, so I can change the times on Sunday.
Oh, there's a new stat on your YouTube analytics, by the way, that tells you when your audience is mostly online.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I'm in the Pacific time zone, and usually that's at 6 a.m. But if I'm going to do a live stream, it's going to be different than, like, say, if I'm going to launch, like if I had a video that I was going to put out, then I would time it for that time. But Wednesday, I'll be on my channel at 2 p.m. Pacific, 5 p.m. Eastern. And
we also have Thursday night with Sterling Cooper again.
We do. Am I on that? Am I going with you on that?
Yeah, you can hop on too if you want.
Okay. Yeah, Sterling's a great guy.
Yeah, we're talking about continuing the conversation.
It's funny, is after we got, I had so many questions for him. Like after we were done with the first one, I was like, I really had all these questions. Like, damn, I should have asked him this.
Well, got him for another 90 minutes this Thursday.
I might just come on and just ask questions on that.
Yeah. One. So if you guys aren't familiar, we did a stream on Rollo's channel, but 2 or 3 weeks ago. Sterling's a porn star. And he's red-pilled, and he has some interesting stories and ideas. So tune in on Thursday night for Playing to the Win.
He will give you a lot of, I mean, I want to say, oh, he's got insider information. Yeah, but I think just from the experience of what he's been doing for as long as he's been doing it, I think he has even greater insight into men's minds, or why like guys come up with the rationalizations they do, particularly when it comes to porn and sex and women's visceral nature when it comes to having sex. That's going to be a really good one. I'm also working on book 4 right now, and I'm in grind mode. So that is, I'm hoping to get it done by the end of this month. We'll see how that goes. But what is today? The 11th. I'm on track. So.
Cool. All right. Thanks for watching. We'll see you guys in the next broadcast. Look for a recording release probably on Wednesday, and we got Sterling on Thursday. And also heads up, next Monday, I've got a guy that wrote a book on his experience, mid-40s-year-old guy sort of thing, that wrote a book on his experience on seeking arrangements, sugar, salt dating, whatever you want to call it. So that should be an interesting one next Monday night before the train wreck. See you guys. Peace out.